Right now, a WISN 12 State of Addiction special.
We're losing hundreds of thousands of people.
The Opioid Crisis.
I hated life. I hated everything about it, but I couldn't stop.
Tonight.
My life was on the line, like literally was on the line.
The toll it's taking on families.
When he relapsed, it was almost harder the second time.
Why opioids are more dangerous than ever.
My daughter tried it one time and overdosed and died from it.
What you can do to help.
Just lock it away.
And hope for recovery.
Pick up the phone today, get yourself some help.
The Opioid Crisis. What every family needs to know. In partnership with the Mark Wahlberg Youth Foundation, DEA 360, and Walmart. From the WISN 12 studios, here's Derek Rose and Diana Gutierrez.
Good evening. I'm Derek Rose.
And I'm Diana Gutierrez. Lives have changed dramatically over the last year, but Wisconsin's opioid crisis has not.
In the most recent statewide results available, the number of opioid deaths grew more than 8 times from 2000 until 2019. And in Milwaukee County, the numbers jumped another 34% in 2020.
Now, for several years, WISN 12 has covered the state of addiction in southeastern Wisconsin. And tonight, we hope to refocus some attention on it again.
One of our partners for this program is the Mark Wahlberg Youth Foundation. You might be familiar with the acting Wahlbergs, Mark, Donnie, and Robert, but brother James is an accomplished writer, director, and also a recovering addict. We start with his story. Can you open up and share a little bit with our audience about your personal connection with this subject?
Absolutely. So I'm a person in long-term recovery. And, I got started with drugs and alcohol at a very, very young age. By the time I was 12 years old, I was homeless. By the time I was 13, I was a ward of the state. By the time I was 17, I was in state prison. And it wasn't until the second time I went back to state prison that I started to try to take a look at my situation and my life and what was I going to do about it. And to be honest, I had a divine intervention. Mother Teresa came to the prison I was in and looked right at me and said I was more than the crimes that I committed, that I was a child of God. And I was like, whoa. And that, in combination with the 12-step groups that I was involved in, really started to make me think maybe I could also get better, right? Because I was on the fast track to doing life in prison for sure. And so, a day at a time and with a lot of work, I've been able to maintain this beautiful gift of recovery for over 30 years. Your foundation is working with the DEA 360 campaign in a partnership. Tell us about this collaboration. So, I made a film a couple of years ago called If Only.
I went to a party once and got high. Big deal. Who doesn't do that my age?
We did an event and we had a DEA agent be part of the presentation that we did. He loved the film, he loved what we were doing, and just brought the DEA sort of to the table. They were looking to do or expand on their educational component that they have. It was a marriage made in heaven, really. And why is the work of the foundation so important in terms of this particular topic? Well, it's funny. I often get asked the question, why? And my response is always the same. Why not? Why? And why isn't everybody, right? Like, I'm so overwhelmed and excited by the fact that you're doing this, right? That your station has chosen to have this conversation, right? Because if we don't have this conversation, then we end up losing more and more people. So my answer is always, why not? And why isn't everybody having this conversation? We're losing hundreds of thousands of people, right? It's unbelievable. And finally, I would ask you to speak to 3 different groups of people. Parents, as you mentioned, who would be watching this, someone who was on the edge thinking about recovery, and someone who was already in recovery. What would you say to those 3 groups of people and what you want them to get out of this special? I'm going to talk to the parents first. Your children, and I'm sorry, and I hope this doesn't sound condescending or anything in any way, but too many parents are worried about their children being their friends, right? Your children are not your friends. They're your responsibility. So I would encourage parents to talk to their kids, ask them what their friends are doing, ask them what they're being offered, what kind of uncomfortable situations they're being put in, and give them the ability to be able to call you to get saved, if you will, right? and worry about consequences later. But I was so worried about my son being my friend because I didn't have a great relationship with my dad. And so because of that, I missed a lot of signs, and I wasn't paying close enough attention, and we paid a price for that. For people who are early in recovery, again, we talked about this phone, right? This phone can be a lifeline, right? Use it. There are meetings now, recovery-based meetings that you can join that are all going on around the world. And people that are thinking about getting in recovery, I would say no time like the present, right? Because the next time you use could be the last time you use, right? Because, the people that are making these drugs and the people that are mixing these drugs, they're not your friends. They don't care about you, right? You're just a customer to them, right? And guess what? A calling card or an advertisement point is when a bunch of people overdose and die from your product. That's a selling point. Can you imagine that? Oh, it's really strong. We got to get that one, right? So don't wait till tomorrow. Pick up the phone today. Get yourself some help today.
All right, Jim Wahlberg with the Mark Wahlberg Youth Foundation. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your story as well. And thank you for your words of encouragement for our community.
Thank you. And once again, I just want to thank you guys so much for having this conversation. You really might contribute to saving somebody's life today. So thank you.
As you'll hear often over this hour, the effects of the opioids are unpredictable. Jim Wahlberg struggled with addiction for years. Alexis Crandall barely had time to struggle at all. She was only 17. Her mother was with her in the hospital when she died.
I never thought I would be giving pieces of you away. It feels like a dream. Any minute now, you're going to sit up, throw your arms around my neck and say, "I love you, Mama." Here they come. I can hear the gurney coming down the hallway. They're really going to take you. How do I say goodbye? She did not wake up. And that's a picture of the last hug that I ever gave my daughter.
How was your daughter, her personality?
She was a good kid, very independent. She was very smart. She had a lot more guy friends, I guess. She was one of the guys. And we were really close. I thought she had told me everything that was going on in her life, but that I soon found out that was not the truth.
And so, Melanie, I want to take you back. How and when did you find out Alexis was addicted?
I actually didn't deal with addiction. I got a phone call one night saying that my daughter was in the emergency room from her boyfriend and that he thought she had done heroin and that she was overdosing. And that is the first time ever that I heard anything about it or that I knew anything about it. It's kind of like, I think of it as a double-edged sword. I didn't have to deal with the years of addiction that a lot of families have to go through, the lying, the stealing, the financial burdens that they have to go through. But on the other side of the sword, my daughter tried it one time and overdosed and died from it.
So that one time that you got the phone call that she had overdosed, that was the first and only time you ever received any type of drug-related call.
It's Wisconsin, so you think of underage drinking, and that being an issue. You don't think in, Jefferson, Wisconsin, USA, that you're going to have a heroin epidemic or, 17-year-old children dying from it.
I mean, do you think it was just like maybe, it could be a multiple things like peer pressure? Was she experimenting? I mean, was this kind of just like influence around her?
I do kind of think that it was a lot of peer pressure. I think that a lot of young boys and girls, if their significant other or boyfriend or girlfriend says, "Hey, I'm doing it," or "Hey, you should try this," or "If you don't, I'm going to break up with you." I mean, kids are so emotional nowadays and they take those things to heart. She didn't necessarily have the best, her childhood wasn't the easiest. I was a single parent, struggled a lot. Her father was an alcoholic and a drug addict. So there is some family history with it.
So what do you have to say to families who perhaps are living in the shadows that don't want to yet admit or talk about it or be rather in the public eye facing issues like this? What do you have to say to them?
First of all, you can't be ashamed of it. I think that a lot of people are working really hard on trying to remove the stigma of addiction. You can't be one of those parents that's going to say, it's not my child. It was somebody else's kid that got my kid to do it. You have to own up to it, I guess. I was never proud of the fact of what happened to my daughter, but it didn't do me any good to be ashamed of it and to hide behind it either. I've met a lot of families, a lot of parents who have come up to me and thanked me for getting up on the stage and sharing my story because they never had the strength or courage to do it. I don't know if it makes me a stronger person to be able to talk about it, but I've seen too many children die. I've seen too many moms and dads trying to plan their child's last outfit and, figure out what urn they're going to put their child in, which is some of the most horrible decisions that a parent should ever have to make. You have to talk about it. You have to talk about it. You have to share with your kids, I think, also, if there is addiction tendencies that run in their family, so that they kind of have an idea. If I'm going to mess around with this, maybe I will get addicted. You just have to talk. I can't express that enough.
It's been 8.5, almost a decade since your daughter passed away in 2012. If you could, what would you say to her now?
Oh my God. I've thought of this many, many times. The first thing I would do is tell her that I love her. I don't know that I told her that day. I don't know that I told her that day. And we're kind of always have been a family that when you get off the phone with somebody, you say, I love you. And I don't believe that I said that to her that day. So that would definitely be the first thing that I would tell her. I would probably also sit down and talk to her and say, hey, what's going on? Is something bothering you? Are you struggling? What's the situation with you and your boyfriend? Just to get into her head a little bit more. I think you kind of think when your child gets to be older, 15, 16, 17, you don't really have to be there. They don't need you as much. But I think I have realized that was the time that she needed me the most.
So the question a lot of people may have is, what makes opioids so dangerous? Dr. Ryan Feldman is a toxicologist with the Wisconsin Poison Center, an emergency medicine pharmacist with Froedtert and the Medical College of Wisconsin. He's also an assistant professor at the Medical College. We hear this term opioids so often and how more prevalent it's become over the last few years. But some folks may not know particularly what an opioid is. Kind of give us that definition and why opioids are in fact so dangerous.
So an opioid is any drug that stimulates the opioid receptor in your body. And there's a lot of different drugs that can do that. Many people are familiar with prescription opioids that we use therapeutically to treat pain. That would be things like oxycodone, hydrocodone, or morphine. And people are also probably familiar with some of the illegal opioids like heroin or the synthetic opioids that heroin is frequently cut with to make it more potent, like fentanyl or its analogs. But it doesn't stop there. At the Poison Center, we deal with some of the more interesting opioids, synthetic opioids, which are man-made to actually evade legal detection or detection from drug screens, things like brorphine or U47700. So kind of interesting synthetics.
Talk to us a little bit about the cases that you see where somebody may overdose and had no idea how much opioid or how much of an opioid they had or how much fentanyl or another cut agent was in the substance they consumed.
Well, this is a serious problem. When we think overdose, we think a lot of people conjure up ideas of people with substance use disorder who are maybe injecting drugs. But this can happen to anyone. This can happen to people who are medically prescribed opioids and have a dose increase that's too much for them, or people who take opioids regularly and it builds up in their system. Even a child who has access to a parent's opioids at home and accidentally eats a tablet, we run into that at the Poison Center quite frequently.
And in terms of when a person gets to that point of overdose, what is the antidote? I know we talk a lot about naloxone. Kind of go down that path for us.
So naloxone is an amazing antidote. It 100% reverses the effects of opioids. So if you get an overdose, you can become too sleepy, unconscious, unresponsive, and stop breathing. Naloxone will reverse those effects and allow somebody to start breathing again. And in the state of Wisconsin, naloxone is available to anyone without a prescription due to a standing order from our Department of Health. We won't treat someone who has an active opioid addiction that needs treatment, but it will keep somebody alive through an overdose so that they can seek recovery and get the treatment they need.
We know you may already have questions. Dr. Feldman will be one of the experts joining us again live to take your questions on the 12 News Facebook page.
Now, it's not just the addict who lives with addiction, and recovery is not always permanent.
Learn to love him from a distance. Now my parents are struggling again because they don't have a relationship with their son.
Next, a local family's struggle.
And the COVID pandemic may have stolen the headlines from the opioid crisis, but we'll look at how it's also made the crisis worse when what every family needs to know continues.
I don't care if I take from you. I don't care if I steal your TV. I don't care what I do to you. I just want my drugs.
Every morning I would be like, all right, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. But then by noon, you know, that voice in the back of the head would start creeping up and I couldn't stop myself from doing it.
Welcome back to our State of Addiction special, what every family needs to know. The road to recovery is rarely straight or smooth, and that road may never end, Derek.
Ashley Nowakowski's family is traveling that path. She is the executive director of Your Choice to Live Incorporated. Ashley, thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon. First off, can you give us an idea of what Your Choice to Live, your nonprofit, does here in the community?
Sure. We provide prevention education. So when we were living through it as a family, we didn't have a lot of education. We didn't know where to go. And so when my brother got sober, we decided that we wanted to go out there and share our story. We wanted to provide education so that other families didn't go through what we did.
And you mentioned your brother. This particular topic is very personal to you. Can you walk us through his journey and his path to substance misuse?
Sure. So he started using substances in 6th grade, alcohol, cigarettes, progressed to marijuana use, then prescription pills. And by 17 years old, he was using heroin. And obviously it wasn't on our radar. And being a sibling, I didn't really know what was going on. His personality changed. My parents saw the changes, but his use just progressed to the point where our home was always chaotic. We were always walking on eggshells. Nobody wanted to be around each other. And, you know, I began to hate him because my parents were fighting all the time. And we just never knew when we were going to get that call that he wasn't going to, you know, be with us anymore.
And you mentioned this was during the teenage years, and you said 6th grade. That's what, about 12, 13, 14 years old. How did that happen? How did he get introduced to that path?
So he was in football and he would go over to a friend's house after practice, and he started drinking with their older siblings before football practice. And so he liked that feeling. And then anytime somebody else offered him something, he would just jump at that chance.
And how did your brother eventually find sobriety?
So my parents eventually had enough. And after 10 years of going through this, they kicked him out. He went and lived in a drug house. And about 2 weeks later, my parents said, you know what? You can get help and we'll support you, or you can keep doing what you're doing. So he did decide to go through treatment. He did really well. He was sober for 10 years. And about 2 years ago, he relapsed. So now we're back to where we were 20 years ago, except now he's just older. And so it's been a long journey.
And during that first time when your parents kicked him out of the house and he wasn't there, how hard was that for you, not knowing where your brother was? And did you ever think he was coming back home?
At that point, I was relieved that he wasn't in our house, you know, because I can't explain how awful it was. But, you know, you always in the back of your mind, you always worry about, you know, is this going to something going to happen. And then when he did decide to get treatment, it did take a little bit to, want to be around him and trust him. And we were able to build a really great friendship. For the past, I would say 8 years, we were so close. And then when he relapsed, it was almost harder the second time than it was the first time, just because we had a really strong bond.
And how have things changed since his relapse?
I've had to do a lot of growth myself, and I've had to do a lot of self-reflection and learn to love him from a distance. He's old enough to make his own choices, and I just can't be a part of that right now. And then it goes back to where we were as a teenager. Now my parents are struggling again, because they don't have a relationship with their son. So my hope is that, one day we can reconcile and have an open conversation about the things that have transpired since the relapse.
And for folks who are watching this, what do you want them to take away from hearing your story and your brother's story and the overall impact of your family's story, really?
The things I want people to take away is that siblings are affected just as much. And so when you have somebody in your family that's struggling, we have to make a little bit of effort to make sure that the siblings are okay. I also want people to know that there is hope. And even though that's not my story right now, people can achieve sobriety. And hopefully one day I have that with my brother. But I also want people to know that when you do go down this path, there's no guarantee that you will live a sober life. So it is a risk when you start experimenting with substances.
By the chance your brother sees this broadcast and sees you, what do you want him to know?
I want him to know that I love him more than anything. And I hope one day we can get back to where we were a few years ago.
From her powerful story to how to have that tough conversation, when and how does anyone really begin? Dr. Cindy Graham is a licensed psychologist. She's also the owner and founder of the Brighter Hope Wellness Center in Maryland. Dr. Graham, thank you so much for joining us, and we're going to dive into the conversation. You've had over 20 years of experience, so how should a parent respond if asked if they used drugs when they were a kid?
Right, so that can be a very tough question for parents to ask. There might be some embarrassment or feelings of regret, or maybe even that urge to hide and not really tell the truth. And that's really not what you want to do. You want to create an environment of openness, honesty, and trust with your child, especially your teens. And so letting them know that, yeah, you did have a history of using drugs. Maybe it was experimenting. Maybe it was a full-on, disorder that you struggled with. And this is really helpful for kids to understand that it's not just them. There can be a family pattern, a genetic history that's playing a role there. And so lots of times kids feel, they feel ashamed, they feel embarrassed that they're struggling with this. So your openness and honesty can help them to understand that this is something that people often struggle with, including their own parents.
And so a difference that I think is important to point out here, the difference between addiction and experimenting, what does that look like?
Sure, they're very different. So experimenting can be really quite common, where a kid or a teen might be at a party and they try a drug once or twice. It's something that you'll tend to see socially, or perhaps they acquire it from a friend and try it on their own. But when we're talking about a substance use disorder, we're talking about something that's persistent, something that is difficult to get rid of. So oftentimes the person wants to stop, but they're not able to, where they try to stop many times. They spend a lot of time in pursuit of getting their drug of choice. It can impact relationships with others significantly. And experimentation really doesn't have that component. Experimentation is usually here and there. It doesn't affect overall functioning. It doesn't affect your relationships. You're not really craving it or seeking it out. So it really is quite different.
How can parents, keep their children able to have a social life but not go down the path of drugs?
Right. Yeah, it's really, really tough. Again, that openness is important, creating an environment where if the child were to experiment and try a type of drug, that the parent is not coming down on the child harshly, that they're understanding, that they're working through the problems. Get to know your child's friends so that you know who they're socializing with and who they're hanging out with. Give them options. Especially if your child tends to be more socially anxious, do some role plays, run through some situations that they would encounter when they're at a party, and give them the tools that's necessary so that they can feel more confident in saying no. And then lastly, I would say always have an out for them. Let them know that they can call you no matter what time, even if they lied to them about the party. Create that air of openness so that your child can say, look, I'm in a situation I don't like and I don't know how to handle. Can you come get me? Because that's what's really important as well, that they feel supported in being able to say no to what's going on around them.
I would look in the mirror and I could see that death was near.
From the NBA to unemployment and back again, Milwaukee Bucks assistant coach Vin Baker's road to recovery and redemption.
The stress and shutdowns of the pandemic have touched nearly everyone. The impact it's had on the opioid crisis. You're watching what every family needs to know.
Saturday alone, we had 5 calls in under 5 hours of time.
Not long ago, the opioid crisis dominated headlines. Fentanyl now has the label as the deadliest drug in America.
Last year, a new crisis took over.
The first case of community spread in Wisconsin.
I have declared a public health emergency.
But opioids don't listen to headlines. Since 2002, the Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's Office tracked a steady climb in narcotic deaths. And since the pandemic, narcotic deaths jumped 34% within the last year. The experts in the Medical Examiner's Office see the toll of this crisis in their building every single day.
Sarah Schreiber is a toxicologist with Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's Office. Sarah, thank you for joining us today. We want to talk about the numbers in terms of opioid overdoses in Milwaukee County. Where has the trend been over the last few years?
The trend within Milwaukee County has been increasing for the last number of years. We saw a small dip in overall deaths in 2018, but since then everything has been going nowhere but up.
And what trends have you noticed since the pandemic disrupted work, the personal connections, and the support systems folks are having?
Reaching out to those kind of institutions was difficult, or those agencies, and therefore making things difficult for somebody who was looking for resources or medications or getting support that they needed, and therefore those things became extra difficult for them.
And I know your office has the difficult job of the front lines of seeing these deaths and determining how a person died, and then having the conversation, notifying families. How tough of a job is that when it comes to this problem that we're having that's become so prevalent in terms of the number of people who are overdosing because of opioids?
I think each case, of course, is different. There are some families that are naive to the fact that their loved one was using at the time that they died. There are some that are well aware of it and realize like this is the end, and maybe one that we have been expecting for some time, and unfortunately it happened now. And there are other folks that are just, really kind of paralyzed by the information, and they don't know how to process it, what to do with it on top of everything else that is going on. So there's quite a wide array. And we've got an office that can be really proud of the medical investigators that we have that do that kind of correspondence with the families on a daily basis. They do a very good job.
And last question, how problematic has the addition of fentanyl been in this epidemic?
Fentanyl has been a big portion of the casework that we've seen. Greater than 75% of the cases that involve a narcotic involve some form of fentanyl. The vast majority are fentanyl itself, but there is a good number of cases that deal with an analog, and we've had some new ones appear in the last couple of years that just make things that much more difficult. It's difficult analytically to keep on top of those trends and to make sure that we're always searching for the right compounds, but it's got to be even more difficult for the user on the other end of this to understand what it is that they're really purchasing and to be able to consider using that product in a safe manner.
It wasn't, I'm going to kill myself. It was, I realized I'm killing myself.
Addiction may not have taken his life, but it did take nearly everything else from a Milwaukee Bucks coach. Vin Baker's story and how he's helping others.
Plus, more than half of all addicts find their first opioid at home. What you can do to reduce the chances of it happening in yours.
This is what every family needs to know.
You realize, Vin, this is suicide. And that's what shook me up. One of the things about alcoholism addiction is you lose hope.
No matter how far an addict falls, there is hope for a comeback. And few people have climbed as high, fallen as far, and climbed back again than Vin Baker.
Now, the Bucs selected Baker with the 8th pick of the 1993 draft. He played 13 seasons in the NBA, a 4-time All-Star and Olympic gold medalist for Team USA at the 2000 Sydney Games. But he struggled with drugs and alcohol almost that entire time, that addiction finally ending his career.
But Vin Baker is now celebrating 10 years of sobriety, and he's back in the NBA as an assistant coach for the Bucs. For folks who are not familiar with your story, kind of walk us through how you got to where you are right now.
So yeah, I had a rather epic and well-documented fall from grace. You know, started off, had an amazing first 5 years of my NBA career, and then basically was addicted to alcohol. You know, started off just casually drinking like most people do. And before I knew it, within like a year's time of, you know, drinking on the weekends and being like a partying drinker, it came to a point where I actually needed the alcohol to function. Stayed in my alcoholism for years. I mean, it literally wiped out my career, took away all my talents, and then all the off the court stuff that happened to me as far as spiritually, physically, financially. You know, one day I just woke up and said, I got to make a change. You know, 10 years ago, April 17th, I decided to go in, check myself in to get sober. And here I am 10 years later with 10 years of sobriety.
And was there a certain incident that I guess pushed you to the point where you said, I have to get help?
Yeah, it was multiple times. I think first it was professionally, like that was my first when I was with the Boston Celtics, and they basically said, you know, you got to get help. We realize that you have an issue and have a problem. The first time I went was obviously I was embarrassed and in denial. This isn't me. I think more embarrassed. I knew I was an alcoholic, but I think I was more embarrassed being a professional athlete. I think the embarrassment was what made me, my first 3 or 4 times, it kept me from getting the help I really needed, and ultimately kept me from my sobriety that I'm enjoying now.
10 years went from saving your career to saving your life, it sounds like.
100%. Like it's a whole different train of thought. Like I wanted to like save my reputation. I wanted to save my career. I wanted to salvage my money. I wanted to salvage this. And then it just came to a point where my life was on the line, like literally was on the line. And so it was just like my animal instincts, it kicked into survival mode. Like I got to just live. And the only way I'm going to live is to put the bottle down and really give sobriety a real shot. I did. And my life changed drastically by simply abstaining from alcohol.
And one of the things I know you're doing now, you have the Bouncing Back Foundation. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so me and my good friend RJ Bunch and Steve Garros, David Goldberg, and we started a foundation about 5 years ago that we want to help give back to the community, and I want to use my platform and my testimony to save lives. And so we started the Bouncing Back Foundation and to help people in recovery, to bring hope to people who are struggling with addiction. We're getting ready to launch a few recovery centers in the Midwest, in Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, here in Milwaukee. As you probably well know, COVID-19 has not just been about COVID-19. It's opened up a whole different can of worms on things that have been going on in people's lives forever. People have resorted back to, you know, addiction. Opioid crisis is at an all-time high, and certainly alcoholism. So I want to play my small part and see how many people I can help and extend my platform, extend my hope and my testimony to those people who have lost hope.
And finally, Vin, I'll ask you, what is Vin Baker's legacy?
So I want my legacy to be, and I believe I'm working on it daily now, is to be someone who in life was given an extraordinary opportunity, but life happens. And for me, it was alcoholism. And so I want to show people in the world of recovery that you can overcome, you can beat it. You can live life on life's terms, even more so than being an all-star, being an NBA coach, and being an Olympian. I want to be able to show people how I was able to go in this dark world of addiction But by the grace of God, by faith and by trust and by, just believing in myself, I overcame addiction. And so I want to be able to provide that hope. That's what I want my legacy to be.
Remember, after this show, you're going to have the chance to ask questions to some of our experts. You'll want to go to the WISN 12 News Facebook page at the top of the hour. There are also people willing to help you or a loved one find the resources they may need. Hannah Lepper is the Alliance for Wisconsin Youth Coordinator for Community Advocates Public Policy Institute. So, Hannah, when and if you do have conversations with parents who perhaps have addiction in someone that is addicted in their life or know someone of that, what is the biggest roadblock for them in terms of seeking help?
I think for some people, they have to be ready to receive that process and go through that change. And you can't force anybody to be ready to go and change their life. They have to want that change for themselves. So I think they just really have to find that within themselves.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And we also have a list of resources right now on WISN.com/opioids. You can also scan the QR code on your screen. Along with those resources on the page, we are also adding the segments of this special where you can watch again and share them with someone who may need it.
It has never been easy for grown-ups to connect with kids. Meet a high school student who's already making it his life's mission to keep others from getting hooked. This is what every family needs to know. If you need help or know someone who does, go to WISN.com/opioids for resources ready to help. You can also scan the QR code on your screen. And remember, some of our experts will take your questions live on the 12 News Facebook page immediately after this program.
We've met a lot of adults who are leading the fight against the opioid crisis, but there are also teens. Neil Dogra is a senior at the University School of Milwaukee who founded the Opioid Epidemic Awareness Campaign. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I read somewhere that you didn't know you were going to pursue a career fighting addiction until you heard something on the radio.
That's exactly right. I've lived in this area around Milwaukee my entire life. And I had no idea what an opioid was until I was in my freshman year of high school. My dad's one of those people that just refuses to listen to music when he drives his car. And so he had a radio talk on. It was a radio talk done by two professors who were talking about their research with the opioid epidemic and the trends that they were uncovering as they looked at fatality reports. It was really eye-opening to hear that one of the leading causes of non-natural deaths in my city was this class of drugs that I had never heard of. And it was also very inspiring. I just wanted to learn more about what I can do as a student to maybe make a little bit of a difference.
So you worked with social welfare researchers to analyze these trends. What did you learn from that?
I would say my biggest takeaway was opioids are pervasive in Milwaukee, and they are not just affecting one single demographic. And that's what makes opioid addiction so difficult to combat, is that nobody is invulnerable to these terrible, terrible pills.
So tell me a little bit more about the Opioid Epidemic Awareness Campaign.
Well, essentially what really stuck with me, and frankly what bothered me, was the fact that I have lived here my whole life. I consider myself to be a proud resident of the area and an informed citizen, and yet I had no idea what was going on. And so my concern was how many more kids don't know what's going on, and how many more kids are therefore vulnerable to opioid addiction because they don't have access to the proper education. So with that in mind, I started the Opioid Epidemic Awareness Campaign to essentially make a difference through public awareness. The idea is if we can exponentially spread information and awareness, we can hopefully make citizens, from kids to adults, more informed about what's going on, and along the way, hopefully inspire some more people to take charge and take a stance against opioid addiction.
And so along with speaking to middle and high school students, you even made a documentary on your phone. Tell us about that.
Well, when COVID first hit, I was really worried about how I would keep up with my epidemic awareness campaign. In-person presentations were no longer feasible. And also I was concerned because, well, let's face it, I'm a senior right now. I'm going to college next year. And there's a good chance that I won't be in Wisconsin anymore. And so I wondered, how will I be able to keep my message going and keep this campaign strong and present? And so with that in mind, and with a bit of a background in filmmaking, I decided to make a short documentary on what's going on, hopefully an inspiring story that I was able to spread throughout the Milwaukee public school system.
Neil plans to pursue a career in medicine and addictionology.
On April 24th, the Drug Enforcement Agency is holding its National Drug Take-Back Day. Police departments across the country, including here in southeast Wisconsin, are joining the DEA. The Assistant Special Agent in charge for the Milwaukee District Office, John McGarry, is here tonight. Give us the history of Drug Take-Back Day, how it came about, and its primary goal.
Drug Take-Back Day is DEA's response to the increase of prescription pharmaceuticals that were illegally diverted into our communities. And DEA realized that oftentimes citizens had prescription drugs sitting in their medicine cabinets, sitting in their homes, and they had no way of disposing of them. And this gives folks an opportunity to drop these off at select locations and dispose of them worry-free. The problem was that while these narcotics were sitting in people's homes, oftentimes they'd be stolen or diverted for illicit means, unbeknownst to the homeowner or the original recipient of the prescription.
Is it safe to say, or what would be your estimate of the percentage of homes that have prescription drugs just sitting in there, sitting in the home, with the potential to be taken, stolen, or simply abused by someone in the household?
That would be tough to measure, but I'll give you a statistic I think is as equally telling and informative. About 51% of the people that are surveyed said that they got prescription drugs from a friend or family member, either from stealing it from a residence or were handed directly through an illegal transaction, but most of those being stolen or diverted illegally.
And what is law enforcement seeing in terms of criminal activity, in terms of the peddling of opioids?
Heroin has decreased and fentanyl has increased. And oftentimes folks that have begun using diverted pharmaceuticals or prescription controlled drugs seek out other drugs to satisfy the addiction. And instead of getting legitimate prescription drugs, they're either being sold knowingly or unknowingly counterfeit prescription controlled drugs containing oftentimes lethal doses of fentanyl.
What else should people do with their leftover prescription medication that's in their home?
You know, I think that isolate, segregate, and lock them away. There's a lot of commercially available home use medical lock boxes. If you have to have something in your home, just lock it away. Just that one moment's isolation physically of something from an opportunistic grab by somebody that shouldn't have access to it. So just lock it away.
John will join us in a few minutes to take your questions during our live discussion on the WISN 12 News Facebook page after this special.
Next, on the front lines of the fight here in Wisconsin, Attorney General Josh Kaul. Why the state's top prosecutor says we cannot prosecute our way out of this epidemic. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Some of our experts are about to log on to the WISN 12 News Facebook page. They're going to be taking your questions about the opioid epidemic and what you've seen tonight. And remember, you can scan our QR code for resources to help fight addiction at WISN.com/opioids. Derek?
Wisconsin Attorney General Josh Kaul is with us now to talk about the state's role in fighting the opioid crisis and substance misuse. General Kaul, we thank you for your time tonight. Your office has many divisions and personnel. So how broad is the AG's role in fighting this epidemic?
Well, I think we have an important role to play in fighting the epidemic, but so do so many other partners who do really important work on this, from local law enforcement to healthcare providers, to a number of other people. We, for example, have worked to hold large companies accountable that have engaged in false and deceptive marketing practices that contributed to the epidemic. So recently, we announced a settlement with McKinsey, a consulting company, that's going to result in more than $10 million going to support efforts to address the opioid epidemic in Wisconsin.
And I know for myself personally, growing up in the state of Maryland, one of the most notable cases on this subject was the death of Len Bias in my home county, Prince George's County, cocaine intoxication. And you have your prosecutors that are pursuing what's called Len Bias homicide cases. Kind of give us some idea what that is.
That's right. Some of the cases where somebody sold an illegal narcotic, and as a result of that, another person overdosed and died. There are additional penalties under the law for cases where there's a death that results from from the distribution of drugs. But they can also be important cases because they can help us target the larger scale folks. And then, of course, there's the human impact of those cases on the family members of the person who's overdosed, and making sure we get justice in those cases for those families that are impacted by that is important as well.
Being a career law enforcement guy like yourself, you admit you can't prosecute your way out of this epidemic, right?
I think that's right. I think it's got to be a multifaceted approach. I do think that there's an important role for enforcement to play in slowing the supply of drugs into our communities, in particular in going after cases where there's violence involved. But I also think that treatment has a critical role to play here. There are a lot of people who are struggling with substance use disorder, and one of the ways that we can reduce illegal drugs coming into our communities is to reduce the demand for those drugs by helping people get the treatment they need. You know, sometimes people fall into substance use disorder or face other behavioral health challenges because of a variety of other circumstances going on in their lives. And so if we can invest in things like expanded access to mental health care and overall health care, we're going to see better outcomes when it comes to fighting the opioid epidemic.
Attorney General Josh Kaul will be among those joining us in just a few minutes for our live discussion on the 12 News Facebook page.
Now, over the last hour, we've worked to show you the depth of the opioid crisis and the toll it's taking on our community. But there is hope. We've posted a list of resources on WISN.com/opioids. You'll also be able to watch our interviews over again.
But before we move to our online discussion, we'd like to thank our partners at the Mark Wahlberg Youth Foundation, DEA 360, and Walmart. I'm Derek Rose.
And I'm Diana Gutierrez. Good night.